Galilee of the nations. Last week we saw how in Luke chapter 4 the people of the synagogue of Nazareth took Yeshua to the clifftop at the edge of the town with the intention of throwing him off. Just hours earlier, those same people had been marveling at the way he spoke in the synagogue. But because of what he'd said about the healing of 2 Syrian people in the first temple era, the supportive crowd turned hostile toward him and attempted to throw him to his death. But miraculously, he walked right through the middle of the crowd and reappeared later at Capernaum, nearly 42 kilometers away. Now that's a good walking day's distance from Natzeret. Then I concluded that devar with the words from Mattityahu or Mathew, chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. Mattityahu defines Capernaum as a lakeshore town on the ancient borders of Zebulun and Naphtali, the 2 tribal areas. He then went on to describe how the people living in that region were living in a spiritual darkness. It was a region in deep shadow of death, and it was called the Galil of the nations. However, with the arrival of Yeshua, the people there saw a great light in their midst. Mattityahu concludes by saying, from that time on, Yeshua began proclaiming, "Turn from your sins to God, for the kingdom of heaven is near." The real purpose of Yeshua's ministry was finally beginning. However, before we begin to consider the events of his ministry, it is important to look back and deeply consider the words in Mattityahu, why the region was called the Galil of the nations. So what can we understand from the circumstances Yeshua faced in the Galil? We need, first of all, to step back 30 years to when he was born. At that time, when Yeshua was born, the whole land of Israel, including the Galil, was under the rulership of King Herod the Great, who was an Edomite, or an Edomite. And he treated the people of Yehuda harshly. As a direct consequence of his tyrannical reign, many of the towns of Yehuda, or many of the people from the towns of Yehuda, along with Yeshua's own family, fled north to the Galil to escape the direct impact of firstly Herod the Great and his son Archelaus. Now when Yeshua's family returned from Egypt, they migrated straight to Nazareth because the angel told Joseph that they could not return to Bethlehem because Archelaus was more tyrannical than his father. That was the only reason why Yeshua grew up in Nazareth. It was never his hometown. By 6 CE, the whole land of Eretz Israel, including the Galil, was placed under the rulership of Rome. Procurators ruled the territory of Yehuda, or Judah, while the Galil was actually ruled by a tetrarch, Herod Antipas. Even with Antipas as the tetrarch of Galil, it was still subject to the Roman legate of Syria, which was possibly why the people of Nazareth, as we saw last week, reacted so adversely to Yeshua, because he had mentioned 2 Syrian people during the first temple era as having been supported by Yahweh ahead of Israelites. Coming back to Yehuda, also, when Pontius Pilate became procurator of Yehuda in 26 CE, he showed himself to be a tyrant after the style of Archelaus. That meant those who were living in exile in Galil had no hope of ever returning to a peaceful life in Yehuda. Hence the people who had been forced out of Yehuda to live in the Galil were exiles, or in modern language, they were refugees. However, unlike modern refugees, they weren't given support by the host region. All the refugees had to band together to support each other. Now, as we work through the Besorah, the good news, we will begin to see how Yeshua had to work against this harsh, uncaring background, which helps to explain why so many people gathered around Yeshua to be healed from many forms of trauma, physical ailments, and even those who had indwelling unclean spirits. The Galil in which Yeshua had been raised was nothing like the place it is today. It was not a peaceful and serene environment where everyone's happily making a good living, but exactly the opposite. Now, many who followed Yeshua in the initial stages of his ministry were people who were just looking for relief from their personal poverty and deprivation. They were not looking to return back to God and return back to the Torah of Moshe. If a man, for whatever reason, could not pay his debts to the Roman overlords or the tax collector, he was liable to be sold into slavery along with his wife and family. That is the only way that a debt could be defrayed. There was no Shemitah year being celebrated, as it was required according to Torah. Therefore, the debts could not be cancelled. Hence, many people in desperation turned to crimes of burglary, highway robbery, and other forms of crime. Even the working fishermen, like Andrew and Simeon, were forced to hand over substantial portions of their catch to the Roman authorities. Needless to say, many of them worked silently with rebels and secret sympathizers who opposed those heavy-handed demands of the authorities. It was in the midst of all this deprivation that some of the rebels rose up and became what is known as the Fourth Philosophy. That's written about by Josephus. Those were groups that favored a rebellion against the foreign authorities. Along with those groups were the Tzara'at, the Dagomen, and the Zealots, who, of course, started the rebellion which finally led to the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, those groups were a formidable force that stood for independence against the Roman legate of Syria. Even Yehuda Iscariot, or Judas, was possibly a sympathizer with this secret undercurrent that was going on. Against the background, it is easy to see that people were flocking to Yeshua to be healed or freed from demon spirits. But what he wanted from them was to turn back and repent, turn back to Torah. But he did not want them to declare him as the Mashiach or Messiah. They ultimately wanted him to rise up and deliver them from bondage and poverty and from the yoke of Roman rule. But it was not time for that. He did not come for that purpose at that time. So much of the depravity came about because of the whole community had much earlier, of course, turned their backs on Yahweh and Torah. The ordinary people had been governed by corrupt leaders over many generations. From the conquest of Israel by Alexander the Great and onward from that period, there had been rapid defection towards the newly found Hellenistic philosophy and governance, which, of course, later led to the rulership of Herod, who was himself a puppet of Rome. Now, what Daniel the prophet had been told by Gabriel in Daniel, the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verse 24, was finally coming true. In that verse, Yehuda was told that it had just 490 years in which Yahweh wanted them to turn back to Torah and back to the truth. But the leadership took no notice of the words that had been handed down through each subsequent generation. As a direct result, all the curses that Moshe had spoken about in the book of Deuteronomy were finally visited upon that generation in which Yeshua was ministering, and those that lived on through the next 40 years, before the whole system was destroyed with the destruction of the Second Temple. That was because from the First Temple period onwards, they had slowly again wandered away from both the Torah and the prophets, and they had finally got themselves into the situation they found when Yeshua came for his ministry. But the leaders would not acknowledge that there was a man in their midst who could and still will reverse the plight of the people. As we read in Mattityahu, the people were living in darkness and had seen a great light. They were in the shadow of death, but light had dawned. It is against that depressing background that Yeshua found himself working during his ministry, both in the Galil and the territory of Yehuda. And what about Yeshua calling his first Talmudim? Against that background, we see, by turning to the Gospel of Mathew again, chapter 4, verses 18 through 22, how sometime after Yeshua had gone to Capernaum, he went walking on the shores of Lake Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, where he encountered two brothers, Andrew and Shimon, throwing their nets into the lake. Upon seeing them, he said, "Come after me, and I will make you fishers of men." At once they left their nets and went after him. If we cast our minds back to the time when Yeshua was in Beit Anya, after his 40 days in the wilderness, it was the same Andrew and Simeon who were both there at Beit Anya, because they were Talmudim, or disciples, of Yochanan the Immerser. Now during that time, Andrew and Simeon spent at least one day with Yeshua before he returned to the Galil. But it appears that they went back to their fishing, because they're not mentioned as being with Yeshua at Cana or at Nazareth. But now he's returning to them and calling them to follow him. So going on further along the shore, we find he encounters two brothers, Yaakov, who's known in English as James, and Yochanan, John, the sons of Zebedee, who were cousins through his mother's family. They, like Andrew and Simeon, left their father and went with Yeshua. Now both these situations Yeshua is calling for by saying, "Come after me." In saying those words, he is personally inviting them to become his Talmudim. Those four who were called were different from the group of followers that we've been reading about in various references, who are referred to as Talmudim. That is why it is more correct, rather than calling those ones Talmudim, they were actually followers, because those people were simply following him because they had seen the miracles he performed, and they were hoping that he would turn out to be their long-awaited Messiah, who would deliver them from the Roman oppression. They weren't called by him. They came of their own volition. However, at no stage did Yeshua send them away or reject any of them from following him. He accepted their presence. But the crucial point is that he did not personally call them, just as he had done with Philip, and then of course the two brothers Andrew and Shimon, along with Yaakov and Yochanan. And not to forget, Philip was the first one he had called when he was at Beit Anya with Yochanan the Immerser. Until Yeshua called for fishermen, Philip was the only person he had personally called. On the day of leaving Beit Anya to return to the Galil, he did not call Andrew or Shimon. Instead, he called only Philip. But Philip himself is not mentioned again until Yeshua names the 12 emissaries in Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 16. what Yeshua did is said and recorded in the three synoptic Gospels, Mattityahu, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All three say virtually the same things as we saw in reading this morning from Matthew and Mark. Then the words are remarkably similar. Therefore, I will often refer to just one account, but because the wording is slightly different, I will oscillate between the three different Gospels. Now, starting in Mark chapter 1, verse 21 to 22, we see how, having Andrew and Simeon, Yaakov and Yochanan, Yeshua entered into the synagogue at Capernaum on the Shabbat, and he was again asked to teach. As before, the people were amazed at the way he taught. They compared his words with those of the Torah teachers, who normally delivered the weekly devar. They were amazed how his words rang with authority. Mark continues in verses 23 to 28 to tell of the unclean spirit that shouted out to Yeshua, most likely during the service while he was delivering the devar. The unclean spirit in verse 24 says, "What do you want with us, Yeshua of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." In response, Yeshua rebukes the unclean spirit by saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." At which, of course, the spirit left the man, and the man lay on the floor unharmed. Next, the people who had witnessed the incident said, "What is this? A new teaching, one with authority behind it. He gives orders even to unclean spirits, and they obey him." So what the people were witnessing on that occasion was a direct confrontation between the demonic spirit that had made its home in a man. During Yeshua's ministry, there will be a number of situations where demonic spirits will confront Yeshua because they knew who he was, and they became fearful that he was going to imprison them, just like the fallen sons of God, who went in and had sexual relations with the daughters of men before the flood of Noah. So we'll consider in more detail in a later session when we come to Yeshua's journey to Chorazin, the district on the other side of the lake. In Luke chapter 8, we'll see where he encounters the man full of demons, a legion of demons, in the graveyard. So returning back to the synagogue of Capernaum, we read yet again that all who were present were astounded at the way he managed the unclean spirit and what they had witnessed. They spread the word all over the Galil. They did not need Facebook or YouTube. They just used word of mouth. The message spread very quickly. Now what about Simeon's mother-in-law? Continuing in Mark chapter 1, following the time in the synagogue, Yeshua withdraws to the house of Simeon's mother-in-law's house. And she was sick with a fever. Now taking her by the hand, he lifts her onto her feet, and she immediately becomes well and went off to prepare food for her guests. Switching over to Mattityahu chapter 8, verse 16 and 17, we see how that same evening many people came to Yeshua because of what they had seen and heard and what he had done in the synagogue earlier that day. They brought others who were possessed with demons, others that were suffering from all sorts of various illnesses. Finally, in verse 17, we're told, this was done to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Yeshayahu, or Isaiah, in 55 verse 4. He took our weaknesses and bore our diseases. Then moving over to Luke chapter 4, it says, about that occasion he laid hands on the ones who needed to be healed. He also called demons out of many. And the response of the demons was, "You are the Son of God." But rebuking them, he did not permit them to say that they knew that he was the Mashiach, or the Messiah. As we have considered previously, Yeshua was very careful to avoid being called the Messiah, either by people or demons. That day must have been exhausting, both physically and spiritually, because when we return to Mark chapter 1, we're told that early in the morning, the very next morning, while it was still dark, Yeshua awoke and went off to a lonely place to pray. Doubtless, he needed to be recharged by his Father. But he never had any time alone. In verse 36, Shimon and the others went after him, and upon finding him, they said, "Everyone is looking for you." His response, "Let's go somewhere else, to the other villages around here. I have to proclaim this message to them also. In fact, this is why I came." So the whole cycle began yet again in other villages as he traveled through the Galil. He taught in their synagogues, he expelled even more demons, and then in Luke chapter 4 verse 43, he said to his 5 called out Talmudim, "I must announce the good news of the kingdom of God to other towns too. That is why I was sent." Those same words are confirmed in Mattityahu chapter 4, verses 23 through 25. He says there, Yeshua went on all over the Galil, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing people from every kind of disease and sickness. The word spread throughout all Syria. The people brought to him all their ill, suffering from various diseases and pains, and those who were held in the power of demons, epileptics and paralytics. He healed them all, and a huge crowd followed him from the Galil, from the 10 towns, Jerusalem, Yehuda, and ever Ha-Yadim. There was no internet, but clearly the word was spreading everywhere. The 10 towns and ever Ha-Yadim that are mentioned were the territories east of the Yarden or Jordan River, where the 2.5 tribes of ancient Israel had settled after Yeshua or Yehoshua had conquered the land of Canaan. The way the news spread meant that people were coming to Yeshua from every direction with illnesses and demons, wanting to be cured and freed from demon possession. So let's look for a moment at the man with Tzara'at. Mark chapter 1 concludes saying that while Yeshua was in an unnamed town in Galil, a man afflicted with Tzara'at came begging on his knees to be made clean. Now we know from the Torah of Moshe that anyone afflicted with Tzara'at was banished from society unless he could be cleansed. But as we saw last week, when Yeshua was back in Nazareth, he spoke about the days of Elisha, when many people in Israel had Tzara'at, but not one of them was made clean, only a Syrian. It appears from the verses in Mark that even in Yeshua's time, Tzara'at was still a major problem that could not be cured by any Cohen, prophet, or anyone else. Only God could cleanse a person. Yet in Mark chapter 1, 41 to 42, it says, moved with pity, Yeshua reached out his hand, touched him, and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." Instantly, Tzara'at left him, and he was cleansed. Then Yeshua said to the man in verse 44, "See that you tell no one. Instead, as a testimony to the people, go and let the Cohen examine you and offer for your cleansing what Moshe commanded." The crucial point was that the man should tell no one. Why? because Yeshua knew that if a Cohen examined the man who had been cleansed from Tzara'at, he would immediately realize it was a miraculous act of God. So the question would be, how could this be possible? Nobody in Israel had ever been cleansed of Tzara'at. The Cohen would simply ask the man to make the required offerings before Yahweh, and that would be the end of the matter. But of course it could only happen in the temple in Jerusalem. And Yeshua knew that the whole matter would need to be kept silent, because to make public a cleansing would be a major problem in Yehuda, because it had never happened before. However, Yeshua's worst fears were materialized in verse 45. He, the cleansed man, went out and began spreading the news, exactly what Yeshua told him not to do, talking freely about it, so that Yeshua could no longer enter a town openly. He had to stay out in the country, where people continued to come to him from all around. Showing pity on that man with Tzara'at cost Yeshua dearly, because from that point on he had to be doubly careful where he went and with whom he associated, for fear of the question of his messiahship constantly coming up yet again. The work continues. Next week we will consider more of the events that occurred around the central parts of the Galil. There we will see again how the sequence of events, as recorded in those three synoptic gospels, do not follow any chronological pattern, but instead mix up the order in which the major events occurred during Yeshua's ministry. So in conclusion, today we saw that during the time of Yeshua's ministry, the environment in both the regions of Yehuda and Galil were hostile and dangerous. It was far from the peaceful and serene situation that is often portrayed by people. We also saw how, while in the synagogue at Capernaum, he confronted the man with the unclean spirit. He drove it out of the human host, while managing to avoid the spirit drawing attention to the fact of his messiahship. Later that same day, he cured Shimon's mother-in-law of the fever and enabled her to host the guests overnight, while healing many in her house of physical ailments and demonic spirits. Then, before dawn the next day, Yeshua escapes to the hills to pray with his Father in heaven, only to be followed, of course, by Shimon and the other Talmudim. Realizing the need to share his ministry, he went to many other places round the Galil, and he visited many of the small towns. However, on the one occasion when he was confronted by the man with Tzara'at, it was because he took pity on him and cleansed him of his Tzara'at that it became a problem to Yeshua. He then instructed the man, of course, not to tell anyone, just to go up to Jerusalem, be examined by the Cohen, offer the sacrifices needed according to Torah, and you will be cleansed. And that would be the end of the matter. But it never turns out that way. Instead, the man broadcast his cleansing and made Yeshua's life even more difficult, because of the need to avoid people openly claiming that he is the Messiah. Such were the people that Yeshua had to work with. Shabbat Shalom.